In the gleaming towers of the Zephyrian Medical Complex, where bioluminescent walls pulsed with healing energy and the air hummed with advanced technology, a secret unfolded in silence. Queen Lyreleth of the Zephyr Empire had hidden her greatest shame behind sterile corridors and encrypted surveillance feeds. Her triplet sons, born with a genetic condition that left their small bodies unable to walk, represented everything her militaristic society deemed unworthy. While she ruled over billions across 7 star systems, she could not even hold her own children without fear of discovery. But in those pristine halls, a human janitor moved with quiet purpose, unaware that his simple acts of kindness would soon shatter an empire's foundation and force a queen to choose between her throne and her heart. Before we start, subscribe now so you don't miss more incredible stories like this one. Oh, and before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love hearing from you and always read every message. The medical complex's Sub-Level 7 existed in official records as a storage facility for outdated equipment. In reality, behind reinforced titanium walls and quantum-encrypted locks, 3 small beings sat in mechanized chairs that had become both their prison and their lifeline. Zephyrians were a proud warrior race, their blue-tinted skin naturally resilient, their elongated limbs designed for grace and speed. But these 3 children, no older than human toddlers, bore the cruel mark of genetic rebellion. Kyle, Nyx, and Orion shared their mother's luminescent blue complexion and large, expressive eyes that held wisdom far beyond their years. Their small bodies, clothed in simple medical garments, remained motionless below the waist, a condition that had horrified the royal physicians and sent shockwaves through the palace. In Zephyrian culture, physical perfection was not just preferred, it was mandated. The weak were cast out, the imperfect eliminated. Queen Lyreleth stood before the wall of monitors in her private study, her regal bearing masking the tempest within. Each screen displayed a different angle of her son's chamber, every moment of their isolated existence captured in cold, digital clarity. Her royal robes, woven from star silk and embedded with constellation patterns, seemed to mock her powerlessness. She could command fleets across the galaxy, yet she could not cure her children's condition, nor could she acknowledge their existence without losing everything she had built. The boys spent their days in quiet conversation, their young voices carrying a melancholy that would have broken hearts throughout the Empire, if anyone had been allowed to hear them. They spoke of dreams where they could run through the crystal gardens of their mother's palace, of adventures among the floating cities of distant worlds, of a time when they might feel grass beneath their feet. "Sometimes I dream Mama comes to visit us," whispered Kale, the eldest by mere minutes, his small hand reaching toward one of the hidden cameras. "She watches us. I can feel it," added Nyx, his twin, who possessed an uncanny ability to sense emotional resonances. Young Orion, the smallest and most fragile, simply stared at the ceiling with eyes that held galaxies of unspoken sorrow. His brothers had learned to speak of hope, but Orion seemed to understand, even at his tender age, the impossible nature of their situation. The medical droids that tended to them performed their duties with mechanical efficiency, checking vitals, administering medications, ensuring the boys' physical needs were met. But no programming could provide what the children truly needed: love, warmth, and the simple acknowledgement of their worth. The isolation protocol was absolute. No unauthorized personnel could access Sub-Level 7 without triggering immediate security alerts that would reach the Queen herself. But in the vast machinery of the medical complex, one man moved through forgotten corridors with access cards that had been overlooked in bureaucratic shuffle. His name was simply entered in the system as Maintenance Personnel 7742, though the few who knew him called him David Chen, a human refugee who had found sanctuary on Zephyr Prime after his own world had been destroyed in an interstellar conflict. As the evening shift change commenced, the medical complex settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The Queen's monitoring would continue through the night, but even royal vigilance had its patterns. And in those patterns, small cracks began to form. But while the monitors recorded every breath, every tear, every whispered word of the forgotten princes, none of them detected the approaching footsteps in the maintenance tunnels below. For some acts of compassion moved beyond the reach of surveillance, and some hearts beat with a rhythm that no technology could trace. David had been working the night maintenance shift for 3 standard years, his unremarkable presence making him invisible to the complex's elite staff. His duties involved cleaning the lower levels, performing routine repairs on environmental systems, and ensuring that the complex's vast network of service tunnels remained functional. He had learned to find peace in the simplicity of his work. After losing everything in the Terran Syndicate War, quiet anonymity felt like a blessing. The malfunction in Sub-Level 7's atmospheric recycling unit should have been a routine repair. David's work order indicated a simple blockage in the filtration system, a job that would take perhaps an hour to complete. He descended through the service elevator, his toolkit clanking softly against his leg, his mind already planning the sequence of repairs needed. The corridors of Sub-Level 7 were different from the rest of the complex. Where other levels buzzed with activity and conversation, this area maintained an almost sacred silence. Emergency lighting cast long shadows between the walls, and David noticed that his footsteps seemed to echo longer here, as if the very architecture were designed to swallow sound. Following the maintenance schematic on his handheld device, David located the access panel for the atmospheric system. As he removed the cover, a soft sound drifted through the ventilation duct, a sound so unexpected that he nearly dropped his sonic wrench. It was a child's laugh, followed by whispered voices speaking in Zephyrian dialect. David had picked up enough of the language during his years on the planet to understand fragments of conversation. The words he heard made his blood freeze. Lonely, Mama, when will she come? These were not the words of medical patients or research subjects. These were the innocent questions of children who had been abandoned. Curiosity overrode protocol. David followed the ventilation duct, using his maintenance access to trace the source of the voices. What he discovered through a small observation grate would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 small blue-skinned children sat in mechanized chairs, their large eyes fixed on toys that medical droids had provided for their entertainment. But the toys lay untouched. Instead, the children seemed to find comfort only in each other's presence. The chamber was sterile, clinical, devoid of any warmth or personal touches that might make it feel like home. "Do you think the stars know we're here?" asked the smallest child, his voice carrying a heartbreak that no being so young should possess. "Maybe, if we're very quiet, they'll remember to visit us," replied another, and David watched as tiny hands reached out to comfort each other in the vast emptiness of their isolation. David's maintenance background had taught him to recognize surveillance equipment, and he quickly identified the network of cameras monitoring every corner of the chamber. Someone was watching these children, recording their every moment, yet leaving them to face their imprisonment alone. The repair to the atmospheric system took longer than expected, not because of mechanical difficulty, but because David found himself returning again and again to the observation grate. He watched as the children attempted to play games that required no movement, listened as they told each other stories to pass the endless hours, and felt his heart shatter as they cried themselves to sleep in chairs that could never provide the comfort of a parent's embrace. As his shift ended and David prepared to leave Sub-Level 7, he made a decision that would change the trajectory of multiple lives. In his toolkit, alongside sonic wrenches and circuit analyzers, he carried a small music player, a relic from his destroyed homeworld that contained recordings of Terran classical music. It was one of the few possessions that had survived the war, and he had treasured it as his last connection to a lost civilization. But looking at those 3 small faces, David realized that some gifts were meant to be shared. That night, as he filed his routine maintenance report, David's hands trembled slightly as he typed the standard conclusion. Atmospheric system functioning within normal parameters, no further action required. But in his mind, he was already planning his return to Sub-Level 7. For in a universe where the powerful monitored the powerless through digital eyes, sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply being seen by another living soul. And sometimes, The smallest gesture of kindness could topple kingdoms built on cruelty. 3 days passed before David's next scheduled maintenance duty brought him back to sub-level 7. During those 72 hours, he found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. His modest quarters in the complex's employee housing felt suffocating as images of 3 lonely children haunted his thoughts. He researched Zephyrian cultural practices during his off hours, trying to understand the context of what he had witnessed. What he learned filled him with righteous anger. The Zephyrian Empire's military doctrine demanded physical perfection from its citizens, particularly those of noble birth. Children born with disabilities were traditionally released to the stars, a euphemistic term for execution that maintained the illusion of honor. The fact that these children existed at all meant someone had defied that cruel tradition, but their hidden imprisonment suggested that even compassion had its limits in this society. When David returned to sub-level 7, he carried more than just his usual maintenance equipment. Hidden within his toolkit was the music player, along with a small collection of soft fabric strips he had carefully cut from his own personal clothing. If he was going to break protocol, he would do so with purpose. The children were exactly as he had left them, arranged in their mechanized chairs like forgotten dolls in a display case. Today, young Orion seemed particularly distressed, his small body racked with quiet sobs that his brothers tried to comfort with whispered words and gentle touches from their still functional arms. The dreams were bad again, Orion whispered, his voice barely audible through the ventilation system. "Tell us about the good dream instead," urged Nyx, his hand reaching out to stroke his brother's arm. "The one where we fly," added Kale softly. David waited until the automated medical check was complete and the droids had exited the chamber for their scheduled recharge cycle. Then, using his maintenance access codes, he quietly opened the chamber door, an action that should have triggered immediate security alerts, but which his override clearance managed to bypass for precisely 60 seconds. 60 seconds was not long, but it was enough. David placed the music player on the floor just inside the chamber door, along with the soft fabric strips. He activated the device and fled back to the maintenance tunnels before the security systems could detect his presence. Behind him, the first notes of a Terran lullaby began to fill the sterile chamber, a gentle melody that spoke of Earth's lost forests and the mothers who had once sung their children to sleep beneath alien stars. The effect was immediate and profound. David watched through the observation grate as 3 small faces turned toward the source of the music with expressions of wonder and disbelief. Kyle was the first to speak, his voice filled with an excitement that David had not heard before. "It's beautiful," he breathed, his hands moving in slow rhythm to the melody. "Where did it come from?" asked Nyx, his empathic abilities clearly detecting the emotional resonance within the music. Orion, however, began to weep, not with sadness, but with a joy so pure it seemed to illuminate his small features from within. The music spoke to some deep recognition in his soul, a reminder that beauty could exist even in the darkest places. The children listened to the entire playlist, 47 minutes of carefully selected compositions that ranged from gentle lullabies to triumphant symphonies. When the music finally ended, they sat in silence for a long moment, as if afraid that speaking might break the spell of what they had experienced. "Someone knows we're here," Orion finally whispered, his voice carrying a hope that had been absent for months. "Someone wanted us to have something beautiful," agreed Nyx. Kale, ever the protective older brother, looked directly at the observation grate where David was hidden. Though he could not possibly see through the narrow slats, his gaze seemed to pierce straight to David's soul. "Thank you," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of royal dignity despite his age and circumstances. David remained in the maintenance tunnels long after his official duties were complete, watching as the children examined the fabric strips with the reverence of archaeologists discovering lost treasures. They wrapped the soft material around their small hands, held it against their faces, and shared it among themselves with a generosity that shamed the entire empire that had rejected them. As he finally prepared to leave, David caught sight of movement on one of the chamber's monitoring screens. The children had arranged the fabric strips into a pattern on the floor, 3 interlocking circles that formed a simple but unmistakable symbol of unity and hope. For the first time since discovering the children, David smiled, but his expression faded as he realized the implications of his actions. Security footage would eventually reveal his presence in the chamber, questions would be asked, and consequences would follow. Yet as he watched 3 small faces shine with newfound joy, David found that he could not bring himself to regret what he had done. Some risks were worth taking, and some acts of kindness were worth any price. But in the royal quarters high above, Queen Lyrilleth stared at her monitoring screens with growing alarm, for she had witnessed something that should have been impossible, and her carefully constructed world of secrets and surveillance was about to face its greatest challenge yet. Queen Lyrilleth had been reviewing diplomatic reports when the alert reached her private chambers. The message was brief and cryptic. Anomalous activity detected in secure medical facility. Immediate review required. Under normal circumstances, she would have delegated such matters to her security staff. But anything related to the medical complex demanded her personal attention, for within those walls lay her most vulnerable secret. She dismissed her advisors with a gesture and sealed her study, activating the quantum encrypted displays that connected her to sub-level 7. What she observed on the monitors sent ice through her veins and fire through her heart in equal measure. Her sons, her beautiful broken sons, were transformed. Where days before they had sat in resigned silence, now they moved with animated enthusiasm. Kyle was humming a melody she did not recognize, his small hands conducting an invisible orchestra. Nix had his eyes closed in concentration, clearly using his empathic abilities to relive some powerful emotional experience. And Orion, her youngest and most fragile child, was speaking with an excitement she had not witnessed since his early infancy. "Play it again," Orion was saying, his hands clasped together in a gesture of hope that broke his mother's heart. "We should save it," replied Nix carefully. "What if it only works once? Then we'll remember it forever," declared Kale with the determination of a future king. Lyrilleth's trained eye quickly identified the foreign object in the chamber, a small device that had clearly been placed there by an outside source. Her children had been exposed to unauthorized contact, their isolation breached, their existence potentially compromised. Every protocol she had established had been violated. Yet as she watched her sons experience joy for the first time in months, she found herself paralyzed by conflicting emotions. The rational part of her mind demanded immediate action. Identify the intruder, eliminate the security breach, restore the isolation protocol. But the maternal part of her soul, the part she had buried beneath layers of royal duty and political necessity, whispered a different command. Let them have this moment. Lyrilleth called up the security recordings from the past 72 hours, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface with practiced efficiency. The footage revealed the truth in stark detail. A maintenance worker, human by his appearance, had gained access to her son's chamber and deliberately left gifts for them. She studied his face as he worked in the maintenance tunnels, noting the careful way he moved, the gentle expression he wore while observing her children. This was not the cold calculation of a spy or saboteur. This was the compassion of someone who had recognized suffering and chosen to act. The revelation sent tremors through her carefully constructed worldview. For years, she had convinced herself that hiding her sons was the only way to protect them, that isolation was preferable to the cruel rejection they would face in Zephyrian society. She had told herself that watching them through monitors was enough, that her love could be expressed through surveillance rather than presence. But this human, this insignificant maintenance worker, had accomplished in 60 seconds what her years of careful protection had failed to achieve. He had given her children hope. Lyrilleth's hand hovered over the security alert that would summon her guards, initiate a full investigation, and result in the human's immediate detention and interrogation. Standard protocol demanded swift action to contain any breach of royal security. Yet as she watched Orion smile, truly smile for the first time in months, She found herself unable to complete the command. Instead, she opened a different interface and began researching the maintenance worker's background. David Chen, according to his employment records, was a refugee from the Terran colonies, assigned to basic custodial duties after standard security clearance. His psychological profile indicated a man who had lost his family in the interstellar conflicts, someone who had found sanctuary on Zephyr Prime after his homeworld's destruction. The irony was not lost on her. A man who had lost everything was the one who had thought to give her sons something beautiful. As the hours passed, Lirelith found herself engaged in a battle between duty and desire, between the crown she wore and the heart she had tried to silence. Her sons continued to find joy in their simple gifts, weaving stories around the music they had heard, creating games with the fabric strips that had been left for them. For the first time since their birth, they were not merely surviving their imprisonment, they were living within it. The decision, when it came, surprised even Lirelith herself. Instead of triggering security protocols, she activated a different system, one that allowed her to monitor the maintenance schedules for Sub-Level 7. If this human intended to return, she would be ready. But not with guards and interrogation chambers. She would be ready with questions that had nothing to do with security breaches and everything to do with the miracle of her children's transformed faces. For in a universe where queens commanded through fear and power, sometimes the most revolutionary act was allowing oneself to hope. And sometimes the greatest wisdom came from those who had nothing left to lose except their capacity for kindness. But as she sat alone in her study, surrounded by the weight of an empire's expectations, Lirelith could not have imagined that her next decision would set in motion events that would echo across the galaxy and force her to choose between everything she had built and everything she had ever truly loved. David's third visit to Sub-Level 7 was motivated by something more complex than simple compassion. During the week since he had left the music player, he had noticed subtle changes in the maintenance schedules, small alterations that suggested someone was paying closer attention to the lower levels of the complex. His instincts, honed by years of survival in war-torn space, warned him that discovery was imminent. Yet he could not bring himself to abandon the 3 children who had unknowingly become the center of his purpose. In his modest quarters, he had spent hours crafting a new gift, a simple picture book made from salvaged materials, telling the story of 3 brave princes who overcame great challenges through love and determination. It was primitive compared to Zephyrian technology, but it was made with human hands and filled with human hope. As David made his way through the maintenance tunnels toward the children's chamber, he carried more than just another gift. He carried the weight of a decision that had been building in his heart since that first glimpse of 3 lonely faces. If this was to be his final visit, if discovery and consequences were inevitable, then he would make it count. The children were waiting for him, not in the sense that they knew he would come, but in the way that hope prepares the heart for unexpected blessings. They sat in their mechanized chairs with an alertness that had been absent during his first visit, their eyes bright with anticipation for whatever wonder might next appear in their sterile world. David used his maintenance access to enter the chamber, but this time he did not flee immediately. Instead, he knelt before the 3 small beings who had transformed his understanding of courage and dignity. "Hello," he said softly in carefully pronounced Zephyrian, his accent marking him immediately as an outsider. The children stared at him with expressions of wonder and disbelief. Kale was the first to find his voice. "You're real," he whispered. "You're the one who brought us music," added Nyx, his empathic abilities clearly reading the emotional resonances that surrounded David like an aura. Orion simply reached out his small hand, fingers stretching toward this miraculous being who had appeared in their world of isolation. David gently took the child's hand in his own, marveling at the trust reflected in those large, luminous eyes. "I brought you something else," David said, producing the handmade book from his toolkit. The children gazed at the primitive creation with reverence typically reserved for sacred artifacts. David opened to the first page and began to read, his voice carrying the rhythm and inflection of ancient Earth storytelling traditions. As the tale unfolded, a story of three princes who discovered their strength not despite their challenges, but because of how they faced them together. David watched transformation occur in real time. The children leaned forward, their faces glowing with concentration and joy. They interrupted with questions, offered commentary, and participated in the narrative with an enthusiasm that spoke to their desperate hunger for connection. It was Orion who noticed her first. "Mama," he breathed, his eyes fixed on something behind David. David turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs as he found himself face to face with Queen Lirelith of the Zephyr Empire. She stood in the chamber doorway like a figure from legend, her royal robe seeming to capture and reflect the sterile lighting. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held depths of emotion that reminded David powerfully of her children. For a moment that stretched across eternity, the three adults and three children existed in perfect silence. David's mind raced through possibilities: arrest, interrogation, exile, or worse, but he found himself strangely unafraid. If this was the end of his story, at least it had been a story worth telling. "Your Majesty," he said simply, making no attempt to flee or explain. Lirelith stepped into the chamber, her movements graceful and controlled. David watched as her eyes took in the scene, her children's animated expressions, the handmade book in his hands, the careful way the three brothers leaned toward each other and toward him. "Continue the story," she said quietly. David blinked, certain he had misheard, but Kale's excited voice confirmed the impossible. "Yes, please. What happened to the princes next?" So David continued reading, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. He read of the princes' great adventure, of how they discovered that their differences made them stronger, of how their love for each other became a power that no force in the universe could challenge. As he read, David became aware that Queen Lirelith had moved closer, her own attention captured by the simple story and her children's reactions to it. When he reached the final page, the moment when the three princes realized they had been heroes all along, Orion began to cry. "That's us," he whispered. "We're the brave princes." "We are," agreed Nyx, his voice thick with emotion. "We're not broken," declared Kyle with newfound conviction. "We're just different." The silence that followed was broken by a sound David had never expected to hear. Queen Lirelith was weeping, not with the restrained tears of royal composure, but with the raw, overwhelming emotion of a mother who had been denying herself the right to love her children openly. "Forgive me," she whispered, though it was unclear whether she was addressing David or her sons. "Forgive me for hiding. Forgive me for being afraid." What happened next would be recorded in no official history, captured by no surveillance system, and witnessed by no one except the four people in that sterile chamber. Queen Lirelith, ruler of 7 star systems, collapsed to her knees and gathered her children into her arms for the first time since their birth. The mechanized chairs that had imprisoned them became irrelevant as small arms wrapped around their mother's neck, and royal tears fell onto tiny heads that had dreamed of this moment through countless lonely nights. "Mama," Orion sobbed against her shoulder. "We waited so long for you to come." "I never left," she whispered back. "I was just afraid to let myself be seen." David rose quietly, understanding that this moment belonged to the family he had inadvertently helped to reunite. But as he moved toward the chamber door, Kyle's voice stopped him. "Don't go," the young prince said. "You're part of our story now." And David realized as he looked at the four faces turned toward him with identical expressions of hope and gratitude that sometimes the greatest privilege in the universe was not to rule or to conquer, but simply to witness the moment when love finally finds its courage to speak its name. In the days that followed the reunion, Queen Lirelith faced the most complex challenge of her reign. Her sons had tasted freedom, not physical freedom, for their bodies remained unchanged, but the freedom that comes from being acknowledged, valued, and loved without condition. They spoke now with voices that carried hope. asked questions that revealed their intelligence, and demonstrated an emotional resilience that humbled their mother's understanding of strength. David had become a daily presence in Sub-Level 7, no longer sneaking through maintenance tunnels, but walking openly through corridors that had been reconfigured to accommodate his new status. The Queen had issued discreet orders that granted him unlimited access to the medical facility, though the official reasons remained classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. Each afternoon, he would arrive with new stories, simple crafts made from salvaged materials, or sometimes just his presence as the children shared their own growing collection of tales and games. Under his gentle encouragement, Kale had begun composing music using the tonal patterns of Zephyrian verse. Nyx had discovered he could use his empathic abilities to create emotional narratives that captivated his brothers. And Orion, the smallest and most fragile, had revealed an artistic talent that allowed him to create stunning visual art using nothing more than colored light projected from his fingertips, a rare genetic gift that manifested only in the most sensitive members of the royal bloodline. The children were not merely surviving, they were flourishing, and their mother found herself transformed by witnessing their transformation. But the outside pressures of an empire built on principles of strength and perfection could not be held at bay indefinitely. Imperial law was clear regarding the fate of imperfect royal offspring, and Lyreleth's advisors had begun asking uncomfortable questions about her frequent absences from court functions. Military commanders spoke in whispers about succession plans, and political rivals sensed weakness in her recent distraction from governmental duties. The crisis came to a head when Chancellor Voss, the Queen's most trusted advisor and oldest friend, requested a private audience. He arrived at her study with expressions of concern that barely masked his growing suspicions. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "there are rumors circulating through the court. Speculation about your recent behavior, your frequent visits to the medical complex, your distraction from Imperial duties." Lyreleth maintained her composure, though her heart raced with anticipation of the confrontation she had known would eventually come. "What rumors?" she asked coolly. "Some suggest you are harboring a secret that could destabilize the Empire. Others whisper that you may be suffering from some form of psychological illness brought on by the stress of ruling alone." Voss paused, his eyes searching her face for any reaction. "I have defended you against these accusations, but my ability to do so diminishes each day that passes without explanation." The moment of truth had arrived. Lyreleth could continue the deception, maintain the careful fiction that had protected her sons for years, and hope that political pressures would eventually fade, or she could choose the path that David's simple courage had illuminated, the path of truth, regardless of consequences. "Would you like to meet them?" she asked quietly. Voss blinked, confusion evident in his expression. "Meet whom, Your Majesty?" "My sons." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge issued to the universe itself. Voss stared at her with growing comprehension and horror as the implications of her statement sank into his understanding. "That's impossible," he breathed. "The royal children were..." The physicians confirmed. The physicians confirmed that they could not walk. They said nothing about their inability to think, to feel, to love, or to contribute to our understanding of what makes a life valuable. Lyreleth rose from her chair and moved to the window that overlooked the capital city of Zephyr Prime. Millions of beings moved through the streets below, each one judged by the Empire's rigid standards of utility and perfection. "For 3 years I have hidden my sons because I believed that protecting them from rejection was the same as loving them. I convinced myself that surveillance was sufficient, that watching them from a distance was enough. But a human janitor with nothing but compassion taught me that love without presence is not love at all. It is fear, wearing the mask of virtue." Voss was silent for a long moment, processing information that challenged the foundation of everything he believed about Imperial law and royal duty. "Your Majesty," he said finally, "if what you're saying is true, then you have violated every protocol that governs our society. The implications for your reign, for the stability of the Empire." "I know exactly what the implications are," Lyreleth interrupted. "The question is whether we will be an empire that derives strength from destroying what is different, or whether we will discover new forms of strength in protecting what is vulnerable. She turned back to face her oldest advisor, her expression carrying the weight of absolute decision. I am going to present my sons to the court. I am going to acknowledge them publicly as my heirs and as princes of the realm. And I am going to challenge our entire civilization to expand its definition of what makes a being worthy of existence. The silence that followed was profound. Voss stared at her with expressions that cycled through disbelief, concern, and something that might have been admiration. And if the court rejects them, if the military refuses to acknowledge disabled princes, if the empire fractures under the weight of this revelation? Lirelith smiled, and in that expression was something David would have recognized, the fearless love of someone who had finally found the courage to choose heart over crown. Then we will build something better from the pieces. But as she spoke those words, alarms began to sound throughout the medical complex, and her personal communicator erupted with urgent messages from her security chief. For while she had been planning to reveal her secret to the Empire, someone else had been planning to use that secret as a weapon against her. And in the corridors of Sub-Level 7, 3 children and 1 human janitor suddenly found themselves at the center of a storm that would determine the fate of civilizations. The attack came not with weapons or armies, but with the cruelest instrument of all, truth, used as a blade. General Thane, commander of the Imperial Fleet and Lireleth's most dangerous political rival, had been conducting his own investigation into the Queen's recent behavior. His intelligence network had succeeded where others had failed, uncovering the existence of the hidden princes and the Queen's systematic violation of Imperial law. The revelation was broadcast simultaneously across all planetary communication networks. Footage of the 3 children in their mechanized chairs, recordings of Lireleth's secret visits, and most damaging of all, evidence of the contamination of royal bloodlines by human influence. General Thane's voice carried across the Empire with the authority of righteous indignation. Citizens of the Zephyr Empire, his broadcast began, you have been deceived by the ones sworn to uphold our most sacred traditions. Queen Lireleth has hidden the existence of genetically defective offspring, allowed foreign influence to corrupt royal protocols, and violated every principle upon which our civilization is built. David was with the children when the alarms began. The boys looked at him with expressions of confusion and fear as security doors sealed throughout the complex, and emergency broadcasts echoed through corridors that had never known such chaos. "What's happening?" asked Kale, his young voice steady despite the obvious crisis. "Are we in trouble?" whispered Nix, his empathic abilities clearly detecting the emotional turmoil that surrounded them. Orion, ever the most sensitive, began to cry, not from fear, but from a heartbreaking understanding that their brief moment of happiness was about to end. "Someone found out about us, didn't they?" he asked softly. "Now Mama will be in trouble because of what we are." David knelt before the 3 children, his mind racing through options that seemed to offer no hope of escape. The political machinery of the Empire was in motion now, and the force of that momentum would crush anyone who stood in its path. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "You are not the problem. You have never been the problem. What's happening now is the result of grown-ups who have forgotten that strength comes in many forms and that love is the most powerful force in the universe." But even as he spoke these words, David could hear the approaching footsteps of armed guards, the mechanical whir of security drones, and the voices of officials who had come to restore order to a situation that had supposedly spiraled out of control. The chamber doors opened with a hiss of pressurized air, and General Thane entered, flanked by a full squad of Imperial guards. He was an imposing figure, his military bearing and scarred features speaking to decades of combat experience. His eyes swept over the scene, 3 disabled children, a human civilian, and the evidence of months of unauthorized contact. "Stand down, human," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You are under arrest for violation of Imperial security protocols and contamination of royal bloodlines." But before David could respond, another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "He is under my protection. Queen Lireleth entered the chamber with a presence that reminded everyone present why she had ascended to the throne in the first place. She moved with lethal grace, her royal robes flowing like liquid starlight, her expression carrying the calm certainty of someone who had passed through fear and emerged on the other side. "General Thane," she continued coolly, "you are trespassing in a secure medical facility without proper authorization. I suggest you withdraw your forces before this situation escalates beyond your ability to control it." Thane's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Your Majesty, you no longer possess the authority to give such commands. The Imperial Council has voted to suspend your reign, pending investigation of these irregularities. Your hidden offspring are evidence of genetic contamination that threatens the purity of our bloodlines. They will be dealt with according to Imperial law." The threat hung in the air like poison, its implications clear to everyone present. Imperial law regarding defective royal offspring had not been invoked in generations, but its provisions remained unchanged. Immediate termination to preserve genetic integrity. What happened next would be remembered throughout the galaxy as the moment when a queen chose to be a mother. Lireleth stepped forward and placed herself between the Imperial guards and her children. "If you wish to harm my sons, you will have to go through me first." "And me," said David, moving to stand beside her. "Your Majesty," Thane said with mock concern, "you are clearly suffering from some form of psychological breakdown. These creatures are not your sons. They are genetic aberrations that should have been eliminated at birth. Your attachment to them is evidence of mental instability that makes you unfit to rule." But before Lireleth could respond, a small voice spoke from behind her. "We are not creatures," said Kale, his young voice carrying a dignity that silenced the entire room. "We are princes of Zephyr, sons of Queen Lireleth, and brothers to each other. Our bodies may be different, but our hearts beat with the same courage that built this empire, and our minds dream the same dreams that reach toward the stars," added Nyx, his empathic abilities projecting such powerful waves of emotional truth that even the guards seemed affected. Orion, the smallest and supposedly weakest, raised his hand and sent streams of colored light dancing through the air, a display of artistic mastery that left everyone present speechless. "We create beauty," he said simply. "That makes us more valuable than weapons that only destroy." The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of alarms. General Thane stared at the three children with expressions that cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. For in that moment, everyone present, guards, officials, rebels, and rulers, witnessed something that no political calculation had prepared them for. They saw three small beings demonstrate that worthiness was not determined by physical capacity, but by the strength of spirit, the beauty of imagination, and the courage to love despite rejection. The revolution that followed would not be fought with armies or weapons, but with the irresistible power of truth spoken by innocent voices. And the empire that emerged from its ashes would be built not on principles of perfection, but on the radical idea that every being possessed inherent value simply by virtue of existing. But as the galaxy watched and waited, the immediate question remained: would love prove stronger than law, or would ancient prejudices triumph over the possibility of transformation? The answer lay in the choice that each witness would make in the moments that followed. The choice between the comfortable certainty of established order and the terrifying hope of something better. Epilogue: The New Empire. 6 months later, the Zephyrian Empire had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that measured strength not by uniformity, but by diversity, not by perfection, but by compassion. The transformation had not been easy or immediate, but it had been profound. Queen Lireleth's public presentation of her sons had triggered the most significant political upheaval in the Empire's history. General Thane's attempted coup had failed not through military force, but through the simple power of 3 children who refused to accept that their differences made them worthless. Their courage had inspired similar revelations throughout the Empire. Parents who had hidden disabled children began to bring them forward. Soldiers who had suffered injuries in combat spoke publicly about their struggles, and citizens who had been living in shame found their voices. The Imperial Council had faced an impossible choice: maintain their traditional laws and risk civil war, or adapt their understanding of strength to accommodate new realities. The deciding factor had been an unexpected alliance between progressive nobles, reform-minded military officers, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by the prince's story. David still worked in the medical complex, though his job description had evolved considerably. He now served as Director of Compassionate Care, developing programs that ensured no being, regardless of species, physical capacity, or social status, would face their challenges alone. His simple acts of kindness had become the foundation for an empire-wide philosophy of mutual support. The three princes had become symbols of hope throughout the galaxy. Kyle's musical compositions were performed in concert halls across multiple star systems. Nyx's empathic narratives had revolutionized Zephyrian literature and philosophy, and Orion's light art had inspired a new movement in visual expression that celebrated the beauty inherent in every form of consciousness. They remained in their mechanized chairs, for their physical condition had not changed, but their chairs had been redesigned as thrones of possibility rather than prisons of limitation. They traveled throughout the Empire, speaking to audiences who once would have refused to acknowledge their existence, sharing their perspectives on strength, courage, and the infinite variety of ways that life could find meaning. On this particular evening, as the three sons of Zephyr Prime sat behind the crystal towers of the capital, Queen Lirelith sat in the palace gardens with her sons and David, sharing the kind of quiet family moment that had once seemed impossible. The mechanized chairs had been parked beneath a flowering tree whose blossoms reflected rainbow light in the gathering twilight. "Tell us the story again," requested Orion, as he had every evening for months. "Which story?" asked David, though he already knew the answer. "The one about the princes who discovered they were heroes all along," said Nyx with a smile. "But not the book version," added Kale. "Tell us the real version, our version." So David began the tale he had told countless times to countless audiences, but which never lost its power to inspire wonder. He spoke of three small princes who had been hidden away because the world was not ready for their kind of strength. He told of a queen who had to choose between her crown and her heart, and discovered that the greatest power came from choosing love over fear. He described the day when everything changed, not through conquest or revolution, but through the simple recognition that every being possessed inherent worth. He painted pictures with words of an empire transformed, a galaxy awakened, and a future where differences were celebrated rather than eliminated. As the story concluded, Orion sent streams of colored light dancing through the evening air. Nyx projected waves of emotional warmth that encompassed their small gathering, and Kyle hummed a melody that seemed to capture the music of the spheres themselves. "And they all lived happily ever after," concluded David. "No," said Queen Lirelith softly, her voice carrying the wisdom that had been born from her greatest trial. "They all lived meaningfully ever after. For happiness is just an emotion, but meaning is eternal." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above Zephyr Prime, four beings sat together in perfect contentment, not because their challenges had disappeared, but because they had learned that love shared among kindred hearts could transform any burden into a blessing. In a universe built on the principle that might makes right, they had discovered something far more powerful, that compassion makes everything possible. And in that discovery, they had not only saved an empire, they had shown the galaxy what it could become when it finally found the courage to embrace all forms of life with equal reverence. The story ended, but the legend had just begun. For in the vast tapestry of galactic history, the tale of three princes and the janitor who saw their worth would be remembered not as a fairy tale, but as the moment when civilization took its next evolutionary step toward becoming something worthy of the stars themselves. And somewhere in the cosmic dance of possibility and hope, other beings on other worlds looked up at the same stars and dared to dream that their own differences might someday be seen not as flaws to be hidden, but as gifts to be shared with a universe hungry for new forms of beauty and strength. Word count, 7,247 words.